Hello, and welcome to the first episode of ADHD History. I'm your host, Xander Millette, and I'm here to tell you the history of the world in no particular order. Today I'm going to tell you about a short guy who history overlooks while his son gets all the credit, his son who collected crowns like they were going out of style, his grandkids who were greedy as all heck, a church that had a heck of a time getting the people in charge to stay alive, and a dead guy defending himself in court.
Ooh. Ah.
I just want to give a quick disclaimer before I start that I have cats, and they have been particularly vocal the whole time I've been trying to record this. So if you hear any weird yodels in the background that sound like they're coming from a well, chalk it up to cats gonna cat, and nobody can stop them.
Cats. I'm a kitty cat, and I'm meow meow meow, and I'm meow meow meow.
Now, on to the story. Let me tell you how the Carolingian Empire got up and running. The empire got started with a guy named Pepin the Short. Yes, I know that name seems ridiculous, but from what I can find, the best reason historians can figure is that he used to be called Pepin the Minor or Pepin the Younger, but it got mistranslated as the Short in the 11th century, since that's around the time that the name appeared. Another reason could have been to differentiate him from all the other Pepins in his family tree. And spoiler alert, there's a lot of them. I also read something that said Pepin might have had dwarfism, and that's where the name came from, but nobody seems to know for sure. There's also some argument that his name was Pippin, not Pepin. But if I call him Pippin the Short, all I'm going to think about is Pippin the Hobbit from Lord of the Rings.
Fool of a took.
So Pepin it is. Anyway, Pepin the Short was the first Carolingian king. His dad was Charles Martel, a.k.a. The Hammer.
Stop. Hammer time.
Best nickname ever. The Hammer was the mayor of the palace, which basically meant he was the manager of the Frankish kingdom. He ran everything, including leading the armies into battle. So when Pepin inherited his father's job, he believed that the one doing all the work should have the title to go with it, and he wanted to be king of the Franks. The issue was that the current ruling family, the Merovingians, wanted to keep ruling. The Merovingians used to be a powerful dynasty, but they became weak and lazy over the generations. Pepin was the mayor of the palace jointly with his brother Charlemagne for about 6 years. They each ruled half the lands and teamed up to suppress revolts. In 743, the brothers put Childeric III on the throne as the figurehead king of the Franks, and he was to be the last Merovingian monarch. Charlemagne did some deep soul-searching and decided, ruling wasn't for him. So he retired to a monastery. Pepin was on his own. He took a look around, got annoyed, and said, "Screw this noise. I'm technically supposed to be subservient to this dude, but I run this, and I have all the power." And then he appealed to the Pope. Pope Boniface was not only dealing with attacks from the Lombards, but also crap from the Byzantine Emperor. Constantine V had condemned any representation of Christ in churches as idolatry, and tried to order Boniface to do the same. So the papacy was looking for a champion defender, and Boniface basically told Pepin,
"Sure, you can be king. Just help me out with these nutbags."
In 751, Pepin made his move. He forced Childeric into a monastery and proclaimed himself King of the Franks, thanks to the blessing of Pope Boniface.
A blessing from the Lord.
Pepin returned the favor by sending his army into Italy against the pagan Lombards. The Lombards were a Germanic people who ruled a huge swath of the Italian peninsula from 568 to 774. They migrated there and filled in the spots depopulated by the Gothic War. They controlled all of northern Italy and occupied parts of central and southern Italy as well. So Pope Boniface was basically beset on all sides.
It's a trap.
Pepin went in and beat them back out of the central areas of Italy. Instead of keeping control for himself, though, he gave commands of the lands to the Pope. These lands were the first of the papal states. The papacy would have control over these states and more until 1870, but that's a fun story I'll get into in another episode. Suffice to say, it involves a pope holding himself hostage and fascist dictator Mussolini being a peacemaker. Anywho, Pepin the Short was king.
Yay!
and he reformed Frankish legislation and continued the ecclesiastical reforms of Pope Boniface. Then came Pope Stephen II. Pepin had to step in again to protect the papacy from the Lombards. Those guys just did not give up. Pepin secured a few more cities and donated them to the church as more papal states. His reward came in the summer of 754. Stephen II reanointed Pepin as king of the Franks in the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis in Paris. Since life expectancies were short in those days, he anointed Pepin's sons too, Charles, age 12, and Carloman, age 3. The Pope also formally forbade the Franks to ever elect a king who was not of the sacred line of Pepin. He bestowed upon Pepin and his sons the title of Patricius Romanorum, or Patrician of Rome in English. The title was connected to the role of Defensor Civitatis, protector of oppressed citizens, which meant that Pepin was now the defender of the church in addition to everything else. The papacy, for their part, hoped to control Pepin and his successors, and they claimed authority over the Frankish crown with a document known as the Donation of Constantine. It was allegedly drawn up by the first Christian Roman emperor, Constantine I, and it states that a Christian monarch gave his rule up voluntarily to the papacy, and then the Pope magnanimously handed it back. According to the document, the church was the actual power behind every throne and could take that power away as easily as it had been given. The document was a forgery, and there is zero evidence that Constantine ever made any such statement in any way. But there was no way Pepin could have known that. Historians believe that he was probably illiterate, his education having been much more focused on swordplay and tactics, so he had little choice but to believe whatever the clergy told him was on the paper they waved in front of his face. Pepin accepted the condition of the donation of Constantine. His son, however, would not, but we'll get to that shortly. Pepin kicked the bucket in 768, but not before expanding his empire significantly by conquering eastern Septimania and Aquitaine. He died on campaign at the age of 54, and was interred in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, where he was later joined by his wife, and they both remain there to this day. The Frankish Empire was then given to his sons, Charles and Carloman. Sources guess that Charles was 26 at this point, and Carloman was 17. The inheritance law of the land was that they would rule jointly. They split their duties down the same line their father and uncle had, one brother ruling the eastern half of the empire, the other the west. The brothers weren't really on the best of terms because a year after they took over, the Duke of Aquitaine, Hunald II, tried to revolt and take back control after Aquitaine's defeat at the hands of Pepin the Short. Carloman refused to participate in the battle, so Charles went to war on his own. He had been at his father's side during his campaigning and was a skilled commander in his own right. When Hunald II fled, he tried to take refuge with Duke Lupus II of Gascony. But Lupus was scared of Charles, and he turned Hunald over in exchange for peace. Hunald was put in a monastery, and Gascony also surrendered. In 770, Charles married a Lombard princess, Desiderata. Pope Stephen III opposed the marriage, because Lombards, obviously, but his worries turned out to be unnecessary. Less than a year after the marriage, Charles sent her back to her father's court for unknown reasons, and instead married a 13-year-old Swambian named Hildegard. Let me just say here, child marriage is gross. I know it was common back in those days, and was common for hundreds of years after, and it's still legal in a lot of America, but child brides give me Warren Jeff vibes, and it's really gross. Anyway, Desiderata's dad, King Desiderius, was pissed and wanted to ally with Carloman against Charles. But Carloman died in 771, seemingly of natural causes. But by all accounts, he was only like 20. Apparently, some accounts claim he had a severe nosebleed, and I'm just like, damn, that must have been one heck of a nosebleed. Charles then took over Carloman's half of the territory, despite Carloman's wife, Gerberga, claiming that her eldest son should take over as the new joint king, with her as regent. She had no support, so she took her kids and ran away to Desiderius' court. The king of the Lombards supported their claim, which Charles took as a threat to his rule. Pretty reasonable view to have, in my opinion. Desiderius took over some of the papal cities, and he started heading towards Rome. So Charles zipped into Italy, beat the Lombards back to Pavia, and then started a siege on the place in 773. In 774, the Lombards surrendered. Charles captured Desiderius and his family, tonsured them, and imprisoned them in various monasteries. Tonsuring means, well, have you ever seen pictures or TV shows featuring monks and they've got their heads shaved but just on top? That's tonsuring. Anyway, Gerberga and her kids fall out of the historical record at this point, and their fate is unknown. But it's possible they got sent to monasteries too. At least I hope they did, because history is so dang full of people killing off family members to keep them from being a future issue. The Carolingians really liked monasteries as prisons, and it seems really weird to me. I get being super religious yourself, but it seems odd to me that your preferred form of punishment is to force other people to be religious. Or were monasteries early prisons? I guess it's better than murdering everybody you don't like. I don't know. Anyway, some of the Lombards managed to survive. Lombard nobles continued to rule a few southern parts of the Italian peninsula until the 11th century, when they were finally completely subjugated by the Normans. Back to Charles. After defeating Desiderius, Charles had himself crowned with the Iron Crown of the Lombards and became King of Italy. Fun fact, I looked up this crown, and at first glance the thing isn't iron in the slightest. It's a circlet of gold and jewels around a central silver band. So why call it Iron Crown? Well, according to legend, the silver band was made of one of the iron nails of the cross Jesus was crucified on. The legend also says that the crown was made by Emperor Constantine I's mom, and that a past pope gave it to the Lombards as a diplomatic gift, and then that's how Charles got it. It stayed in use for centuries, and it's now housed in the Cathedral of Monza in Italy. It's a pretty cool-looking crown with a cool history, and you should check it out if you get the chance. Okay, so Charles is now iron-crowned. 7 years later, in 781, Charles took his two youngest sons, Pepin and Louis, and had the Pope crown them. Pepin became King of Italy, and Louis became King of Aquitaine. Charles kept the real power, and technically the kingdoms were sub-kingdoms under his own, but he intended for the boys to inherit their kingdoms when he died. Charles took part in so many battles, I'm not going to go into all of them. Suffice to say, the Frankish Empire was engaged in almost constant warfare the entirety of his reign, and he became king of a lot of countries. Objectively, the most important war was the Saxon War, which was roughly 18 battles stretched out over 30 years. It was started in an effort to root out Norse paganism. A Saxon party was said to have burned down a church in what is now modern-day Netherlands, which was at the time part of Charles's kingdom. That gave Charles the excuse he needed to invade. Whether the Saxons burned down the church or not is unknown, but Charles had a great intolerance for pagan beliefs and practices. He was the defender of the church like his dad had been, after all. One of the battles during this war was the Battle of Roncevaux Pass. Wow, I am sure I'm not pronouncing that right. That battle inspired the epic poem The Song of Roland, which was written way after the fact at some point in the 11th century. It's the oldest surviving major work of French literature, and I'm probably going to talk about it again in the future. Charles defeated the Saxons over and over again, forcing the people he conquered to convert to Christianity. He got sick of the constant rebellions by Saxon pagans who flat out refused to convert in 782, and he ordered an estimated 4,500 Saxon prisoners to be beheaded. This move set off a further 3 years of warfare, but the rebellion failed. A few more uprisings cropped up, the last being in 804, but they all failed too. The Saxons still in the area officially surrendered and renounced their national religious customs and their worship of devils. They accepted Christianity and became part of the Frankish Empire. In 799, Pope Leo III was attacked by a group of Roman nobles who felt like he shouldn't be the pope. They accused him of immorality and abusing his office. He fled to Charles for help, and Charles was like,
"Yeah, those guys are really stupid. Let's go clear your name."
Charles presided over a trial in Rome, and Leo proved the accusations were false. But this was humiliating for Leo since it showed that Charles was more powerful than him. It took someone outside the church to help the supposed leader of it keep his power. So Leo decided to try and regain some prestige and authority by coronating Charles on Christmas Day in the year 800 as the Holy Roman Emperor, thereafter forever known in history and in this episode as Charlemagne. Charlemagne allegedly did not want to be crowned by Leo and reportedly said he would never have entered the church if he had known it would happen. But it's pretty well established that the crown was clearly visible in the church when Charlemagne came in, and he was certainly smart enough to realize it hadn't been left there accidentally. Most likely, Charlemagne was happy about the prestige of the title, but was not about to allow the papacy an upper hand to wield their donation of Constantine's pseudo-leverage over him. Remember the donation of Constantine, that document that Pepin agreed to? Charlemagne just ignored it. He donated lands to the church without anyone asking him to, so there really wasn't any reason to try and get him to comply with it. I'm curious, though. Charlemagne was an intensely religious man, and the document basically said that the Pope gives kingly authority and the Pope can take it away. Charlemagne was a very powerful king and only became more so after his ascension to emperor. So I gotta wonder what would have happened if the Pope had tried to dethrone him. Would he have given in, or would events have ensued? It's questions like that keep me up at night. Charlemagne's becoming the Holy Roman Emperor was not without its complications. Becoming so rejected the legitimacy of the line of emperors of Constantinople. It had been over 300 years since there was a Roman emperor in the West, and the Eastern Emperor had been claiming he ruled the East and the West. So it goes without saying that this whole thing caused a wee bit of tension. It was definitely a planned move on Pope Leo's part for a few reasons. First off, Charlemagne had presided over a trial in which he was the defendant. Who could be qualified to pass judgment on the Vicar of Christ? In normal circumstances, the only answer could possibly be the Roman Emperor, and the only Roman emperor was the one sitting on the throne at Constantinople. But at the time of Charlemagne's crowning, that throne was occupied by a woman named Irene. She was the mother of Emperor Constantine V, who inherited the throne from his father at the age of 5. So Irene had been regent until he came of age. She let him rule for a bit, but she didn't want to give up the power she had become used to. So in 797, she had his eyes gouged out and imprisoned him. To the surprise of no one, because healthcare was crap back then, he died shortly after. Mother of the year right there. Anyway, her blinding and murdering her own son was basically inconsequential to Pope Leo. She was a woman, and the female sex was well known to be incapable of governing after all, let alone judge him, the will of God made man. So, as far as he was concerned, the throne of the emperors was vacant, and filling it with Charlemagne was the smart thing to do. Let me just say here, Pope Leo was a moron. Women are more than capable of governing. Irene was a monster, sure, but there's no evidence to say she didn't do the job well. In the years before and after her, history has proven time and time again that women can be great rulers. Elizabeth I, Melisande of Jerusalem, Zimurrud of Damascus, Cleopatra and Hatshepsut of Egypt, Seondeok of Korea, Catherine the Great of Russia, the list goes on and on and on. I could talk about badass women rulers for hours, but that's not the topic of this episode. Getting back on track here, Charlemagne embraced his new title. On official charters, he would have his scribes write, and I'm going to butcher this Latin, Carolus Serenissimus Augustus Adeo, Coronatus Magnus Pacificus Imperator Romanum Gubernans Imperium. In English, that says, Charles the most serene Augustus crowned by God, the great peaceful emperor ruling the Roman Empire. So yeah, this dude was very modest and humble. Charlemagne kept up his campaigns and wars and his reforms in his kingdom. It's actually pretty impressive how he managed to keep everything under control. He had a vast empire, so he divided it into 52 counties, and he appointed a count to run each county. He also had special agents called missi dominici. These guys traveled in pairs to check up on the counts to make sure they were honest and weren't abusing their power. Brilliant. Charlemagne organized his territories into great domains. At the center of each domain was the master's house, then the church, the granary, the barn, the stables, the bakery, and then rows and rows of peasant cottages. Charlemagne took care of the greatest and smallest of details. He would leave local customs and laws to remain in place after gaining control of the territories, and made sure they were written down and recorded so no one could ever say they didn't know the laws. As part of Charlemagne's administrative efforts, he ensured that the laws in the territories were enforced, as well as his own additions. His decisions were final, and he ruled over the church, state, and the lives of individuals. Charlemagne rewarded those that had fought for him on the battlefield by granting them huge tracts of land.
She's got huge tracts of land!
He appointed all of the bishops, and he supervised them as well as the lower clergy. He imposed the death penalty for breaking fast at Lent, and for eating meat on Fridays. Refusing to be baptized could also bring the death penalty. Charlemagne brought a scholar from England, named Alcuin of York, to his capital at Aachen, where he helped revolutionize education. Alcuin was made head of the palace's school, and he created a 7-course curriculum for the palace elite's kids, consisting of grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, astronomy, music, and geometry. Charlemagne hoped all of his subjects would be able to read and write. It's thought that his own difficulty reading and writing was a huge part of his reasons. And to me, the fact that he was basically illiterate and yet accomplished so much is just impressive as heck. Because of the encouragement of Charlemagne and increased flow of money to monastic schools and scriptoriums, monks made so many copies of books that almost every manuscript from that time period is preserved. Most of today's surviving works of classical Latin were copied and preserved by Carolingian scholars. In fact, the earliest manuscripts available from many ancient texts are Carolingian. It's almost guaranteed that any text that survived to the Carolingian age survives. Private libraries flourished, and books were so in demand that sometimes those libraries lent out books, but only if the borrower gave some valuable collateral for the privilege. Imagine if you were go to like a rare book library now and said, "Hey, I want to borrow the Gutenberg Bible." And they say, "Sure, but you got to give us your house." Charlemagne's wife Hildegard died in 783 in childbirth, but not before giving him 9 kids. Unfortunately, only 2 of them were to outlive their father. His son, Louis, King of Aquitaine, and a daughter, Bertha. He had 2 more wives after Hildegard, but Charlemagne outlived them too. He also had mistresses, who gave him a few children, but for the most part, these kids disappear from history. There's a theory that most people in Europe are descended from Charlemagne because he had so many kids, but it's not true. However, most royal or noble European families are descendants. Britain's current King Charles is descended from him, and it's theorized that America's own George Washington and Barack Obama were as well. Seriously, type in Charlemagne to Barack Obama into Google, and you can see the family tree charts. If it's been tracked correctly, Obama is a 39 times great-grandson. In 813, Charlemagne started feeling pretty worn down and summoned his son as well as all of his counts. Of his 18 children, Louis was his only surviving legitimate son. He appointed Louis as co-emperor and made him heir apparent to unanimous consent. He spent the fall hunting, but in January 814, he fell sick with a high fever. Einhard, his personal biographer, wrote, "He died January 28th, the 7th day from the time that he took to his bed, at 9 o'clock in the morning, after partaking of the Holy Communion, in the 72nd year of his age and the 47th of his reign." He was buried the same day in the Aachen Cathedral. In 1165, Emperor Frederick I opened the tomb and reburied Charlemagne in a sarcophagus beneath the floor of the cathedral. And in 1215, Emperor Frederick II reburied him again in a casket made of gold and silver named, I'm going to say this wrong and I know it, named the Karlshrine. The Karlshrine is on display to this day at the Aachen Cathedral in Germany. Louis the Pious held the title of Holy Roman Emperor from 813 to 840. Charlemagne had him crowned as King of Aquitaine when he was 3 and had him raised by the customs and traditions of his territory. The theory was if Louis dressed and acted like one of them, it was less likely they'd rebel against his rule. When he received news of his father's death, he rushed to the court at Aachen and crowned himself. His first act as emperor was to purge the palace of anything he considered undesirable. He had old Germanic pagan tokens and text collected by Charlemagne destroyed, and he exiled members of the court he deemed morally dissolute. He sent all of his unmarried half-sisters to nunneries. He crowned his son Lothair as co-emperor and inheritor of most of his territories, except for a few promised to his other sons. His son Pepin was proclaimed King of Aquitaine, and his youngest son Louis was named King of Bavaria. I'm going to refer to him as Louis the German for the rest of this to avoid confusion. If one of them were to die, their crowns were to be inherited by their sons, but if they died childless, Lothair would get their territories. But in 830, Lothair rebelled against his father, and Pepin joined him. Louis managed to get Pepin to back down by promising him a bigger share of inheritance. Lothair was pardoned, but was banished to Italy. 2 years later, fearing another revolt by his sons, Louis took away Pepin's crown and declared his son Charles King of Aquitaine. He also restored the whole rest of the empire to Lothair, but Lothair was still very interested in overthrowing his dad. Pope Gregory IV gave Lothair his blessing and marched with him north to meet Louis's army on the plains of Rothfeld. Lothair was joined by his brothers Pepin and Louis the German. Pope Gregory IV being on Lothair's side may have sown some dissension among Louis's army, because soon much of his followers had switched sides. Louis was captured, and the site was from then on known as the Field of Lies. Louis had to undertake public penance and confess to the crimes levied against him, which included oath-breaking, violating public peace, and not controlling his adulterous wife. He was sentenced to never hold office again. But a lot of people didn't really appreciate Lothair humiliating his dad like that and revolted, causing Lothair to flee to Burgundy, and Louis to be restored to his throne in 834. Yeah, Louis the Pious was either a crap father or he just had the misfortune to have really greedy sons. When his son Pepin of Aquitaine died, the crown should have passed to his son, Pepin II. Remember how I said near the beginning of this episode that there were a lot of Pepins? Was I joking? No, I was not. Anyway, Louis the Pious declared his son Charles to be the new king of Aquitaine. This ticked off Charles the German and Pepin II, and they led their armies in revolt. But Lothair returned. Lothair sided with his dad for once in exchange for another redivision of inheritance. At the end of it all, Pepin II was disinherited, Louis the German kept Bavaria, and the rest of the empire was roughly divided into eastern and western. Lothair took the eastern part that included Italy, and Charles took the western. Feeling that everything was finally settled, Emperor Louis the Pious disbanded his army. A few months later, he was dead. And the brothers continued fighting. The kingdoms remained split for the remainder of the Carolingian Empire. The last Carolingian, Charles the Fat, managed to unite the kingdoms for the last time in 884, but he died in 888, the last legitimate male ruler of the dynasty. But Louis the Pious's sons laid the foundations for the countries we now call France and Germany. Without them, they wouldn't exist. From the middle of the 9th century to the middle of the 10th, the Catholic Church went through a lot of popes. Between 882 and 965, 24 popes were appointed, and for 8 of those years, 896 to 904, there was a new pope every single year. These brief reigns are attributed to political machinations of local Roman factions, but few sources survive. A lot was happening in Europe during this time, but the key reason for the papacy's issues was the fragmentation and collapse of Carolingian Empire. Pope Formosus occupied the papal throne from 891 to 896. He'd had an eventful career before his election. He had once been Bishop of Portus and had some success converting Bulgarians to Catholicism. But this success brought him enemies. He was accused of plotting to become the Archbishop of Bulgaria and of coveting the papacy. When Louis II of Italy died, the nobles elected his uncle Charles the Bald to succeed him as emperor. The supporters of his other uncle, Louis the German, yeah, another one, fled for fear of retribution. Formosus was one of these. When Pope John VIII ordered them to return, Formosus refused, and he was excommunicated for deserting his diocese without papal permission in 876. The sentence of excommunication was lifted, however, in 878, after Formosus promised never to return to Rome or practice as a priest ever again. In 883, the next pope, Marinus I, restored Formosus to his former post as Bishop of Portus. After 2 more popes had sat upon the throne of St. Peter, Formosus was unanimously elected in 891. Pope Formosus was enemies with the current Holy Roman Emperor, Guy III of Spoleto, especially after Guy forced Formosus to crown his son Lambert as co-emperor in 892. Formosus convinced Arnulf of Carinthia, king of East Francia, to invade Italy and liberate Rome. But Guy died and left Lambert in the care of his mother Agiltrude, who took Lambert to Rome to be officially crowned. When Pope Formosus refused, Agiltrude imprisoned him in Castel St. Angelo. Arnulf marched on Rome and wrested control from Agiltrude and her forces, freeing the Pope. In exchange, Pope Formosus crowned Arnulf the new emperor at a ceremony in Rome in February 896. Arnulf then moved against Spoleto to capture Lambert and Agiltrude, but he had a stroke on the way and was unable to continue. A short time later, in April 896, Formosus died of a stroke, and Lambert was once again in power. Formosus' successor was Boniface VI, but he was only on the throne for 15 days before dying of gout. He would be replaced by Stephen VI, a longtime rival of Formosus. In January 897, Pope Stephen VI ordered that the tomb of Formosus be opened up and his body exhumed.
Bring out your dead!
He wanted the former pope put on trial, both for supporting King Arnulf in becoming emperor and for coveting the papacy years before. He was charged with breaking canon law, as well as perjury and illegally serving as bishop. Even if Formosus had been dead for several months, Stephen was eager to have his revenge on his corpse. This was the Cadaver Synod, or Synodus Horrenda in Latin. Stephen VI's reason could have been to try and gain some points with Lambert and Agiltrude, or it could have been to cover for the fact that Stephen was guilty of the exact same things he was accusing Formosus of. Formosus had made Stephen the Bishop of Anagni, and Stephen had then become Bishop of Rome, a title you get when you become Pope, while he still held that post. But if Formosus could be found guilty of that same crime, being Bishop of Portus and Bishop of Rome, all of Formosus' actions would be null and void, and Stephen wouldn't have been a bishop when he was elected Pope. Stephen also might have been a quarter short of $1, an olive short of a pizza, 1 can short of a 6-pack. You know, completely nuts. The decaying body was propped up onto a throne, and a trial was held with Pope Stephen VI acting as prosecutor, and a deacon was told to be Formosus' defense, while a shocked audience watched the revolting performance. Pope Stephen the Fruit Loop yelled at his dead predecessor, demanding he answer the charges against him. One chronicler of the trial, and I apologize in advance for butchering this name, Liutprand of Cremona, wrote that Stephen asked, "When you were Bishop of Portus, why did you usurp the universal Roman see in such a spirit of ambition?" While Stephen the Nutter tossed allegations at Formosus, the accused remained silent, as one might hope a corpse would be. I don't know about you, but if a dead guy starts talking to me, I'm getting my bug-out bag out of the closet and following my zombie apocalypse plan.
Run away! Run away!
Anywho, in the words of the historian George Ives, the old man's body, like a monstrous doll, might nod and bend while the attendants supported it, or collapse in a ghastly bundle if they left it alone. But it made no sound, and the deacon would probably be wary in his defense, for there were dark holes nearby, other than sepulchres. In the middle of the trial, an earthquake shook the room. A clear sign from God, according to commentators, and I quote, "For the stones themselves, execrating such a monstrosity, then cried out with their own voice by knocking against each other, that they would more willingly suffer spontaneous ruin, than that the Roman Church should remain so depressed by so great a scandal." But Pope Cuckoo Pants persisted with his case, and the dead pope was found guilty of usurping the papacy.
I'm invincible! Invincible! You're a loony.
Stephen VI declared all of his acts as Pope null and void. All consecrations, all appointments, all ordinations were undone. His body was stripped of his papal vestments, and 3 of his fingers were cut off from his right hand, the fingers of benediction. Finally, the body was tossed in the Tiber River. However, the next day it was recovered by some monks and secretly buried in a monastery.
What an eccentric performance.
The people of Rome said enough of this loon, formed a mob, and imprisoned Stephen the Basket Case. He died soon after because someone snuck in and strangled him. The next pope, Romanus, overturned all of the actions of Stephen VI, but he was soon overthrown too. The next guy, Pope Theodore II, was pope for about 20 days, just long enough for him to recover Formosis's body. Then finally, Pope John IX had him reburied in St. Peter's Cathedral, where he remains to this day. Hopefully, he's still silent. So ends today's episode of ADHD History. I hope you enjoyed listening as much as I enjoyed talking about it, and I hope to have you listen in again in 2 weeks. Next episode will probably be about the fall of Rome and the Great Schism if something else doesn't catch my fancy. You can find me on my Facebook page, ADHD History, and on Twitter and Instagram at It's ADHD History. See you next time. Adios!